Get my bearings here. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. It's nice to be here. So I'm a philosopher by training, and I always feel like I need to say that when I'm at these more practical events as a bit of a disclaimer. So you'll have to indulge me a little bit. We will be doing a little bit of philosophy. So on the one hand, I'm sorry, and on the other hand, you're welcome. So I hope that, I hope you follow me along, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. I also apologize because I am a little bit sick, so you get a raspy voice today. So I'm a philosopher of mind and philosopher of cognitive science at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge University, as well as at the Alan Turing Institute. So the work I'm doing is work that I've done there. So the question that I thought I could start with today is, what effect is technology having on our cognitive capacities? And in fact, this is a question that has a really long history in philosophy. So I'm not sure how many people have read Plato's Phaedrus. Okay. Well, actually, Socrates himself took a position on this question. So Socrates argued that the current technology of the time, which was a shift from the oral tradition to literacy. So at the time, the technology of writing words down was being invented, so writing was being invented. And he resisted that, that move, and he thought, we shouldn't write our words down. We shouldn't use any sort of utensils at all to put symbols into the world. And he argued against this for sort of several reasons, but two of which were to say that doing so would have a diminishing effect on our cognition. So he thought that by writing words down, it would make us more forgetful, so we'd have a worse memory, we wouldn't be storing information, and it would also make us less social. So he thought we would have nothing to say to each other. We would just go directly to the text instead of bothering with communication. And what's interesting about this example, which I like to use, is first of all, those are exactly the same arguments you hear against technology today, right? So you hear that Google is making us more forgetful and Facebook is making us asocial. So it's kind of a story that's been happening for a very long time in philosophy, and one that I'll argue against. The second sort of fun and ironic thing about that is that the only reason we know Socrates' view on that position is because his student Plato disagreed with him and wrote everything down. So you often in a Philosophy 101 class, you get students asking, why don't we read Socrates? Well, the guy didn't write anything down, so we don't know anything that he maintains. So I want to suggest that, in fact, the shift to literacy was a good thing, and I hope that you'll agree with me, and that, in fact, a lot of the technologies we use can be used to improve our cognition in more advanced and sophisticated ways. There's a study that I was going to show you about what effects Google is actually having on our cognition and on our memory. It's a study by Betsy Sparrow and her colleagues that was published in Science in 2011. And what that study showed was that, in fact, relying on Google, so when participants were asked to complete a task and they were made aware that they could use Google to complete the task, so the information that they required was immediately available to them in their environment, they were less likely to remember the information itself and more likely to remember how to access it. And so what the study suggested is that one effect that technology is having is that it's redesigning the tasks. So it's not making us less forgetful, we're still remembering stuff, it's just shifting the kind of stuff we have to remember. And I think, so this should ring true in many ways. So I'm at least old enough to remember a time when I had to know my own phone number, all my friends' phone numbers, my relatives' phone numbers. And now I just have to remember the passcode to my iPhone, which stores all that information. So in a sense, I've outsourced that task to the technology. And I imagine most of us have had that experience. So there's a view in philosophy, which has been increasing in popularity since it was first published. This is a view that was defended by philosopher Andy Clark at Sussex University and philosopher David Chalmers in 1998. And the paper they wrote was called The Extended Mind. Has anyone heard of this view? I'm kind of curious. Okay, one or two people maybe. This paper they wrote kind of broke philosophy of cognitive science. So it became the most cited paper in 20 years, and it's what I wrote my thesis on. So I could say a lot about it, but I'll refrain from doing so because we just have a short time. But the idea was that, look, let's take what our current best science of the mind says. Current best science of the mind, plausibly, is cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience says that the mind is essentially an information processing system. So for those of you who don't know, a grounding assumption of cognitive neuroscience is what's called the computational theory of mind, which more or less maintains that your mind is the software that runs on the hardware of your brain. So let's take that seriously. If we take that seriously, then mind is just information processing. But as it turns out, there's a lot of information processing that happens in the world and that we rely on or we offload, which seems really essentially connected to the information processing that we do in our brains. So at the time that Clark and Chalmers wrote this paper, we didn't have iPhones. But the example they gave was just somebody writing in a notebook. And a sort of a version of that, just for those of you who are familiar with Richard Feynman, the sort of Nobel-winning physicist, when he was working with a biographer to account his sort of his life achievements, the biographer asked him, tell me about the thinking process. And he said, you have all my notes, and that's where the thinking happened. So all the notes are there. You have the record of the thinking. So the idea is that for even really sophisticated experts in mathematics and in physics, as well as for the rest of us, a lot of the thinking we do is when we offload it into the world, we put symbols down on paper, and we start to push that around in interesting ways. So that was the kind of example Clark and Chalmers gave. But now, of course, we have much more advanced technologies. So things like your iPhone, which has its own sort of sophisticated neural engines now, and does a lot of processing for you. So it's what got me here today was relying on that navigational system. So what they concluded, and what the extended mind thesis says, is that some of the tools we use, so for me, this phone, can become essential parts of our minds. So literally on a metaphysical par with our brains. And that has some interesting ethical consequences, I think, which hopefully we'll try to get into a little bit. Okay, so part of what my work has been at Cambridge over the last 2 years now has been to think about how we can use AI, and as we'll see, by that I really just mean sort of sophisticated machine learning and deep learning techniques to extend human cognition. So instead of looking at these simple technologies. And this kind of presents a particular definition of AI that is worth articulating explicitly. So a lot of definitions of AI, of course AI is notoriously difficult to define going back to the 50s, but a lot of definitions today include a kind of clause about autonomous agency. So the idea is that we should build a system that can do things entirely on its own without any kind of inputs or reliance on humans. But there's a kind of different definition of AI that's also floating around, which has to do with non-autonomous systems. And those are the kind of systems that I tend to focus on. So these are systems that are being built to interact with humans, to be intimately coupled with us. And this sort of divide in the definition of AI, these two concepts, mirrors a division that's been long-standing with respect to computing systems. So early computing systems were built to have only very crude inputs and outputs by users. Whereas there was this different notion in the 1960s that was developed by Douglas Engelbart and picked up by people like Steve Jobs and Alan Kay at Xerox, where they thought, look, I don't want computers to be this thing that does something completely on its own. I want the computer to be this ongoing interaction between the user and the device. So every time you open your laptop, it's like a conversation that never ends. Okay? It's a part of you. It's an ongoing dialogue. And I think that's the experience that most of us now have with our devices. So it's that type of definition of AI that we're working with. So this is the kind of framework that I wanted to present you with. So on the far left, we have things like autonomous vehicles. Okay, this is a sort of classic example of an autonomous agent. It's a system that performs tasks entirely on its own. And this, by the way, I'm presenting some work from a paper with my excellent collaborator, Jose Hernandez Aralo. So just to give some credit to him, he's based in Valencia. And then on sort of more towards the right, you have increasingly non-autonomous AI systems, so systems that are being linked with human users. So as a kind of example of what we call an externalized system or externalized cognition is when you can outsource a particular sub-process to a machine. So imagine that you use a system to translate some piece of language, right? So that's a sort of sub-process that you've outsourced to that system. But it requires a lot of input and output from you. It really does nothing on its own, right? It requires human input and output. And then more intimately coupled with the user is something that we call sort of extended cognition, what we've called AI extenders. So imagine a system that's so tightly coupled with you that if you lose the system, you lose that capacity entirely. So this is now me without my iPhone in many respects, and I think for many of you as well, whether you want to admit it or not. So I probably couldn't get here if I didn't have my iPhone. And in fact, I thought to myself, thank God I charged my battery last night because I actually forgot to check. And while for some of us that might seem, kind of hopefully an interesting and fun observation, it becomes more of a challenge when we start thinking about sort of the next generation of people who don't even learn the capacity to navigate at all internally. So for us, we're outsourcing a capacity that we've developed internally. For the next generation, they may not be developing it internally at all. And so that leads to some interesting consequences and cognitive effects that are kind of yet to be fully studied. And then this should say C, internalized cognition. So this is sort of another way in which potentially an autonomous system can change the landscape of human thought. So the example I like to give here is of Alphago's Move 37. Has everybody heard of Alphago beating Lee Sedol? Okay, excellent. So if you'll remember in game 2, Alphago made this crucial move. It was called Move 37. It was discussed widely by experts both of Go and of machine learning systems. And it caught their attention because it was such a surprising move. And it was surprising in part because no good human player would ever play that move. And so the game was going so well for AlphaGo, and then there was this really surprising move. It was what Demis Hassabis, the founder of AlphaGo, described as creative. So this shows that the system is potentially creative. And certainly, it was unquestionably surprising. It surprised everyone. It surprised Lee Sedol. And many people thought, it could be a mistake. This could be the reason that the game is lost. But in fact, AlphaGo ended up winning the game. And now people look back on that move as being pivotal to its win. And in fact, now even expert human Go players are training on that move and trying to figure out why was that move so unexpected and what can we learn from moves like that. And so what's interesting, at least for me as a philosopher about examples like that, is that one of the reasons people think that the system came up with that move is that it wasn't sort of being bunkered down or burdened by some of our own social norms and our own game playing norms and our own sort of human wisdom about what's good and what's not good. And that's kind of interesting in itself for things like game playing, but it's really interesting when you think about situations where the stakes are higher. So something like scientific discoveries or drug discoveries or healthcare. So how do we think outside that box? So this is a system, an example where the system was entirely autonomous, but even if that system sort of gets wiped off the face of the earth now today, we still have that wisdom, we still have that insight from that system, and we can still train on that idea. So it has essentially given us a new concept and a new path to a new way to think about that game. So this is all a bit abstract still. I'll try to make it more concrete. So in this paper, we looked, Jose and I looked at we looked at about 14 different cognitive capacities, pretty core cognitive capacities that we thought could be used to extend human cognition in different ways. So I'll give you just a couple examples as we go on. So memory processes, I think, is kind of an obvious one in many ways, right? This is what we've been doing for a long time with language. And in fact, the philosopher I mentioned, Andy Clark, in defending his extended mind thesis, he describes us as the offloading ape. So he says, look, this is maybe what's so special about humans is the fact that we can use tools to offload some of the dirty cognitive labor in the ways that we do, and then free up our internal resources to do more interesting things. And so that's kind of what we have in mind here. So what are the kinds of things that we can use AI for to offload some of the tasks that either we're not good at, we're just not built for them, or that we just don't like doing. So memory is one of those things. I have a really bad memory, so that's one thing I like to use it for. Obviously, decision-making, we're seeing that already being done with AI. So how can we get better information and get better paths to making better decisions by using AI systems? But we can also imagine systems that model us. So we're already, I'm sure many of you have seen some of the studies out of Cambridge Psychometrics. This is the division that unfortunately got wrapped up in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But some of their really great work was to show that just based on your Facebook likes alone, a system can model your personality and preferences with a really high degree of accuracy. So now imagine something like your phone or a system that you actually really trust and give a lot of information to. How well of a picture can that system paint of you, right? What I argue is that my phone probably knows more about me than anybody in the world because it has all of my pictures, it knows everywhere I'm going, it has my notes to myself, it has all my emails, it has all my future plans, and it has that with a perfect accuracy. So based on that information, it could potentially be able to tell me things about myself. So that's what we call metacognition. So it can help me know what I'm good at, what I'm not good at. It can help me model my emotions. How do I react to this person? How might I trigger better reactions to that person? So there's lots of different techniques here in which it can be used for, and which we're already seeing. I thought I would just say maybe a little bit about how we came up with that list. So this is kind of a nice image from Design Hacks, which shows hundreds of human cognitive biases, which have been well studied by psychologists. And all of these kind of gesture towards the fact that we don't really make decisions in the way we think we do. So I know this is kind of illegible, but that's, I guess, kind of the point. There's so many of them. So a lot of times, even though we think we're making judgments in a particular way, we're being informed by all sorts of built-in systematic biases that either cause us to confirm our existing beliefs or to make snap judgments about people, so to stereotype, to make choices that reflect our group's choices, so kind of groupthink biases. So lots of sort of systematic deviations from what most of us would objectively call rational judgments. And they've kind of clustered these into 4 different groups. And I think it gives a nice way of thinking about how AI can be used to help in all those different categories. So the what should we remember? So we are, too much information kind of points to this too. So we're living very much in this post-information world where we are constantly saturated with increasing amounts of information, and we can't keep all that information in our head, so we have a limited storage capacity, and we also have sort of limited processing abilities. So we have to choose what to remember, and we're not always very good at choosing what to remember. And we also have to choose sort of how we're going to process that information, or what information is going to become more salient than other information. So of course, using systems that have huge amounts of storage capacity, we can sort of start to eliminate this question of what we should remember, because we're able to offload so much of that onto the world and to draw on it quite quickly. When it comes to too much information, we tend to find, this is now feeding into this point about not enough meaning. So it tends to be the case that we look for patterns and we look for ways to make sense of the world by using these kind of biases that we have. So as one example, we tend to anthropomorphize, or we tend to think of people who look alike, think alike, and things like that, which affects our moral judgments and affects how we treat people. Whereas having systems that are more objective in those regards can help to either make us more aware of how we're deviating from what the decisions we want to make, or nudge us to behave better. So all of this is kind of a possible space that we can start to think about these systems filling for us. As another example, so we know we have real limitations in our quantitative and logical capacities. So one of the core capacities I mentioned here. So we're very good at discriminating between groups of 4 and groups of 10, let's say, but we're really bad at discriminating between groups of 35 and groups of 100, or groups of 200 and groups of 300, even though there's a larger gap in those numbers. And in some cases, I mean, there's good evolutionary reasons for that. In some cases, that's a positive thing. But in other cases, let's say in airport security, you might need to know exactly how many people are in the room at a particular time. And that's something that an AI system can be very good at. So the sort of obvious weaknesses for us are easy tasks for some systems. And likewise, so we need to act fast. So in some cases, there's just not enough time for us to do certain tasks. And while we could do it, we could be systematic about it, I could count the number of people in the room, there might not be time to do that. So AI systems allow us the possibility to speed that up. Okay, so moving quickly along, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sort of ethical questions and the risks around using technology in this way. One I alluded to earlier was cognitive atrophy. So this is the concern that by becoming too reliant on a technology, we start to diminish our own internal capacities, such that we can really no longer do the task without that tool. And in some cases, that might be perfectly fine. But there's other cases where, it could lead to real safety issues. So there's a kind of trade-off between how reliant we want to be on a technology and how much we really want to develop that skill internally and then offload it to speed things up, let's say. So one example is like the one I gave you. So let's say I needed to get to safety quickly and I had no idea where anything was and no navigational skills. And my phone died. So there's sort of obvious cases where we want to maximize our independence and our ability to operate independently. And then questions of responsibility. So this is probably a more practical concern for people who work in business, which is that if you're getting a lot of your information, let's say if a doctor's getting a lot of information about tumor diagnosis, and they're simply relying on this technology to help them, but they don't know how it works. And we can even imagine that for various professional practice reasons, it's difficult for them to override the decision of what the device says. So there's a professional norm to accept a recommendation, let's say. Then it could leave users in a position where they don't really have a choice, but they may be held responsible. So navigating who's responsible in these instances where you're more intimately coupled with the machine is maybe just as problematic, maybe even more problematic than the cases where you have an autonomous agent doing something. Privacy, of course, digital information is susceptible to hacking, and some of the examples I've given you of effective coupling require a lot of personal information. I have an article discussing how the Apple and the FBI had this dispute over trying to get into someone's cell phone a couple years ago, right? And in fact, there were some cases that happened a couple years after that where the police actually tried to use the facial recognition system on the dead body of a mass murderer to try to break into his phone. And while the details of that case, your sympathies may lie on one side or the other, I think all of us find it somewhat problematic that so much of our information is in that device and that it could be accessed by somebody else. So in fact, the more you buy into this view that these devices really are becoming a part of you, the more you might want to see privacy protections given to them. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Mark Taylor. I'm a compliance consultant, but the question's got nothing to do with that.
Okay.
Just out of interest, have you sort of considered the future implications in the event that we can actually read each other's minds? There's a reason I asked the question. I remember seeing something on the BBC not that long ago on that very subject.
Yeah. So I haven't directly dealt with this question, although some of my work, so that you might think there's sort of two ways in which we could do that. One is by having machines that either have so much information about us, like our phones, that they store a part of our minds, or that they can model our minds so accurately that they can give us access to one's beliefs. Or another avenue, as you might think, that there's some kind of brain-computer interface or brain implant that really gives access to the processing internally of one's brain. And therefore, you don't have to, there's no external device there at all. It's just as close as it can get to one's brain and potentially, therefore, one's mind. Yeah, so I haven't thought about the privacy implications of that. I mean, I guess the sort of obvious answer is that there's serious privacy implications there. In the latter case that I described, what is kind of scary is that, at least in the US, some of these brain-computer interfaces, so things like TMS systems, but also EEG systems in particular, so these are sort of headset devices that record your brain information and then translate that onto a computer screen, and that allows you to do all sorts of interesting things. It gives you a kind of neurofeedback loop, but you can also, now in the US at least, you can buy an EEG headset that allows you to fly a drone just with your mind, and that's just a couple $100. I'm trying to write that off as a business cost soon. So those devices are all kind of attractive and fun, and they're user-friendly because you can buy them on Amazon, but they're also recording your brain information and storing it somewhere in the world, right? And so that leads to obvious privacy concerns, because that could be information that right now we can't make sense of it because we don't have the right techniques, but in the future we could retroactively try to make sense of that information and figure out, some of your beliefs, some of your intentions. So yeah, I think there's big privacy concerns there, and at least in that sphere, it hasn't really been dealt with. Yeah.
Okay, one more question. Thank you. Anyone else want to make a comment?
Yes, my name's Alex Ford. I'm work from BPP as a customer insight manager. But I'm just thinking on the, have you thought about, I know that there's the extended mind theory, so the whole idea that we use cognitive things by using smartphones. Yeah. And then before you said that we used to do that with writing things down and putting our thoughts onto paper. Do you think evolutionary-wise we need to go through another transformation with our brains to get used to that? And the reason I ask that is because obviously there's a huge rise in, depression with social media. And I was wondering, do you think that that's something that we need to go a step further with?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if I would call it an evolutionary step, but I definitely think there's going to be trade-offs, cognitive trade-offs, and potentially so what I describe as imbalances, a paper on cognitive imbalances that can emerge from using technologies like this. So if you just think of, the brain is a muscle, and just like there can be all sorts of muscular imbalances in the body. So if you overuse certain parts of it, it may throw off that balance. So there are some, for example, there are some cases, I think the condition is called hyperthymesia. For people who have really, really good memory, they remember everything, going back to really young. And so there's a sense in which you might think, hey, that's fantastic. That's kind of a, it's a condition in a sort of positive sense. it's a condition because they're an outlier, but it's all good. But in fact, what they report is that it can be quite burdensome, that they can't get over the past. If one person reports being bullied as a child and not being able to move past that because they just relive these experiences. Whereas for the rest of us, as it seems, forgetting and being able to forget, has a good purpose, and it lets us move on with life. And so having a history of all of our personal information, this is the idea of, what people worry about with sharenting, the parents that overshare, is that they're going to have this legacy that haunts them. And so we might see things like that, and then having these kind of trade-offs emerge, but in this kind of external sphere. So. Yeah, thanks. Thank you.